29 years ago, a beloved teacher walked into the darkness of a Pennsylvania autumn night and never came home. The man who killed her? He's been living among you this entire time. October 16th, 1993. Millbrook, Pennsylvania. A small town where everybody knows everybody, where neighbors wave from porches and kids ride bikes until the streetlights flicker on. That night, the annual Harvest Festival filled Main Street with laughter, the smell of apple cider, and the warmth of community. Rebecca Hartman, a 28-year-old elementary school teacher, said goodbye to her colleagues near the library steps. She walked toward her car in the courthouse parking lot, her silver locket catching the glow of string lights overhead. She never made it home. For nearly 3 decades, her family lived with a question that tore them apart. Who took her? The DNA evidence sat frozen in a laboratory, waiting for technology to catch up. And when it finally did, in 2222, the name that surfaced would shatter everything this tight-knit town believed about trust, safety, and the people living next door. Because the killer wasn't some stranger passing through. He was one of them. Someone they smiled at. Someone they trusted. Someone who sat in their churches, coached their children, and looked Rebecca's husband in the eye while hiding the darkest secret imaginable. Before we dive deep into how this cold case was finally cracked, let us know, where are you watching from right now? Drop your location and the current time in the comments below. And if you're ready to see how justice finally caught up after 29 years, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. You won't want to miss what happens next. October 16th, 1993. Millbrook, Pennsylvania sat tucked in Cumberland County, a borough of barely 3,200 residents where brick storefronts lined Main Street and century-old buildings stood as quiet witnesses to generations of history. On this particular Saturday night, the crisp autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves. The annual Harvest Festival transformed the town square into a celebration of community, with children clutching bags of candy corn and parents lingering over cups of hot cider. Rebecca Hartman stood near the gazebo in town square, her auburn hair catching the glow of string lights strung between lampposts. As a third-grade teacher at Millbrook Elementary, she'd spent the evening surrounded by familiar faces, former students waving enthusiastically, parents stopping to chat about upcoming parent-teacher conferences, and fellow teachers sharing exhausted smiles after a long week. She wore a burgundy sweater and jeans, comfortable shoes for a night of walking, and that silver locket her husband Thomas had given her on their 5th wedding anniversary. Rebecca wasn't just a teacher. She was the kind of woman who stayed late to help struggling students, who remembered every child's birthday, who made learning feel like an adventure. At home, she was a devoted wife to Thomas and a mother to 4-year-old Natalie, who worshipped her. The Hartman family lived on Maple Street in a modest house with a front porch where Rebecca would sit on summer evenings, grading papers while Natalie played with chalk on the driveway. At 9:47 p.m., Rebecca said goodbye to her colleague, Patricia Brennan, near the library steps. "See you Monday," Patricia would later recall her saying, her voice cheerful despite the late hour. "Tell little Natalie I'll have her book report graded." Rebecca turned and walked toward the public parking lot behind the old courthouse, where her silver Honda Civic waited in the second row. The lot's single streetlight cast long shadows across the cracked asphalt. That was the last time anyone reported seeing Rebecca Hartman alive. At home on Maple Street, Thomas finished reading Goodnight Moon to Natalie for the 3rd time that evening. When his watch showed 10:30 p.m., Concern started creeping in. Rebecca should have been home by now. The festival wound down around 10, and the drive home took less than 5 minutes. He tried her pager, the essential technology of 1993, entering their home number followed by 911, their personal code for "call me urgently." 10 minutes passed. 20. No response. By 11 p.m., Thomas's concern transformed into worry. By 11:30, worry became fear. He called the festival organizers. No one had seen her leave. He called Rebecca's parents. They hadn't heard from her. He called the hospital emergency room. No Jane Does admitted. At midnight, with his stomach twisted in knots and his hands shaking, Thomas dialed the Millbrook Police Department. Officer Kevin Walsh took the report, jotting down details in his notebook. Missing woman, 28 years old, respected teacher, happily married, no history of disappearing or marital problems. Thomas provided a recent photograph. Rebecca smiling at Natalie's 4th birthday party, her eyes bright with joy. By 1:00 a.m., Officer Walsh and 2 other officers arrived at the courthouse parking lot. What they found made their blood run cold. Rebecca's silver Honda Civic sat exactly where she'd parked it hours earlier. The car was unlocked. Keys dangled from the ignition. Her purse rested on the passenger seat, wallet inside with cash and credit cards untouched. Her makeup bag, house keys, everything she'd need, all there. But Rebecca was gone. At that moment, nobody in Millbrook knew they were living the beginning of their town's darkest nightmare. Sunday morning, October 17th, 1993. Word of Rebecca's disappearance spread through Millbrook like wildfire. By late afternoon, more than 200 volunteers had gathered. Neighbors, teachers, parents, students, and strangers from neighboring communities. They combed fields, checked barns, walked creek beds, and knocked on doors. Everyone hoped Rebecca had gotten confused, maybe hit her head, maybe wandered off, disoriented. But deep down, they knew better. The parking lot where Rebecca's Honda still sat became ground zero. Pennsylvania State Police arrived to take over from local officers, and Detective Marcus Donovan, a 20-year veteran with graying temples and sharp blue eyes, assumed command. He'd worked dozens of missing person cases across south-central Pennsylvania, but something about Rebecca's disappearance felt wrong from the start. Teachers don't just vanish from small-town festivals, not without a trace. Detective Donovan organized search grids, coordinated volunteer teams, and interviewed everyone who'd been at the festival. Every hour that passed without finding Rebecca made the outcome more likely to be tragic. By Monday evening, hope was fading fast. Tuesday morning, October 19th, 1993, 3 days after Rebecca disappeared, brought the news every searcher had dreaded. A teenage boy walking his dog in Michaud State Forest, approximately 8 miles northeast of Millbrook, discovered Rebecca's body in a heavily wooded area off Ridge Road. The boy's screaming brought his father running, and within minutes, Pennsylvania State Police swarmed the scene. Rebecca lay partially concealed beneath fallen branches and leaves, her burgundy sweater torn and stained. The medical examiner would later determine she had been sexually assaulted and strangled. Ligature marks on her neck suggested the killer used something thin and strong, possibly a cord or rope. Time of death was estimated between 10:00 p.m. on October 16th and 2:00 a.m. on October 17th. The killer had transported her body to this remote location, chosen specifically for its isolation and dense tree cover. Detective Donovan stood at the perimeter as forensic technicians worked methodically. Fall 1993 represented a turning point in forensic science. DNA analysis existed, but remained crude, expensive, and time-consuming. Still, The technicians knew to collect biological evidence. Samples of semen recovered from the victim's body, fingernail scrapings that might contain the killer's skin cells, fibers from her clothing, soil samples, anything that might someday identify the person responsible. The evidence was sent to the Pennsylvania State Police Crime Laboratory in Harrisburg. Using restriction fragment length polymorphism testing, the most advanced DNA analysis available in 1993, technicians spent 6 weeks analyzing the semen samples. The results were definitive. They had a complete DNA profile of the killer. The problem? They had nothing to compare it to. In 1993, the National DNA database didn't exist yet. Pennsylvania maintained its own small collection of convicted offenders' DNA, but it contained fewer than 500 profiles. The unknown male DNA from Rebecca's murder didn't match any of them. That evening, Detective Donovan stood in the Hartman family's living room, while 4-year-old Natalie slept upstairs, unaware her mother would never come home. He looked Thomas in the eye and made a promise. "We're going to find who did this." But Detective Donovan had no idea that promise would take 29 years to keep. If you're feeling the weight of this story, hit that subscribe button. We're going deep into how this case was finally solved after nearly 3 decades. The initial response to Rebecca Hartman's murder was aggressive and thorough. Detective Donovan assembled a task force of 8 investigators who worked 16-hour days, pursuing every lead, interviewing every person who had been at the Harvest Festival, constructing timelines and building profiles. This wasn't some half-hearted effort that would be abandoned after a few weeks. This was a full-scale homicide investigation in a small town where everyone demanded answers. The DNA evidence became both their greatest asset and their most frustrating obstacle. The RFLP testing had given them a complete genetic profile of the killer, a scientific fingerprint that could identify him with absolute certainty. But without someone to compare it to, that profile was just numbers on a lab report. It was like having a photograph of the killer's face, but no name to attach to it. Over the next year, investigators interviewed more than 300 people. They documented the movements of 57 registered sex offenders living within 30 miles of Millbrook. Each one was tracked down, questioned, and asked to provide DNA samples. Some cooperated willingly. Others required court orders. Every single sample came back negative. The task force identified 12 potential suspects who either knew Rebecca or had been at the festival that night. One was a maintenance worker at the elementary school who'd been written up for staring at female teachers. Another was a parent who'd been overly friendly during parent-teacher conferences. A third was a man seen arguing with his girlfriend near the parking lot around the time Rebecca disappeared. Each suspect was investigated methodically. Detectives verified alibis by interviewing friends, family members, co-workers. They checked phone records, credit card statements, receipts, anything that could place someone at a specific location at a specific time. They looked for inconsistencies in statements, changes in behavior after October 16th, sudden moves out of town. For those whose alibis couldn't be completely verified, detectives requested voluntary DNA samples. Most agreed. A few refused and required court orders, but eventually all 12 provided samples. Every single one came back negative. None of them matched the DNA from the crime scene. Rebecca's entire life was examined under a microscope. Detectives interviewed her family, friends, colleagues, former students' parents, even people she'd gone to college with. They searched for any indication of a stalker, threatening letters, concerning interactions, secret relationships, anything that might explain why someone would target her. They found nothing. Rebecca's colleagues described her as friendly but professional, well liked by parents and students alike. She had no enemies, no financial troubles, no hidden life. Her marriage to Thomas was solid. Friends described them as genuinely in love, the kind of couple who still held hands after 5 years of marriage. Thomas himself was thoroughly investigated, as is standard procedure. He passed a polygraph examination without difficulty. His alibi was airtight. He'd been home with Natalie all evening, and neighbors confirmed seeing his car in the driveway. There was no life insurance policy that would benefit him, no affair, no motive whatsoever. He was quickly and completely eliminated as a suspect. As the months dragged on, the horrible truth became clear. Rebecca had been the victim of a random predator. Someone who saw her that night, followed her to the parking lot, and attacked her before she could reach her car. Someone who knew the area well enough to transport her body to Michaud State Forest and hide it in a location isolated enough that it took 3 days to find. By summer 1994, the leads had dried up completely. The DNA evidence sat preserved in a laboratory freezer, carefully maintained, but ultimately useless. The case file, now several inches thick with reports, interviews, and dead-end leads, was moved from active investigation to a different status. Fall 1994, 1 year after Rebecca's murder. A red stamp was pressed onto the case file cover. Cold case, unsolved. That red stamp wasn't just ink on paper. It was a death sentence for hope. For the Hartman family, time didn't heal anything. It just changed the shape of their grief. Thomas transformed Rebecca's home office into a memorial. Photographs of her surrounded by candles, her teaching materials in boxes he couldn't bear to throw away, newspaper clippings about the investigation yellowing on the walls. Every October 16th, he and Natalie would drive to Michaud State Forest, placing flowers at the approximate location where Rebecca's body had been found. A crude wooden cross marked the spot where their world had shattered. Natalie grew up with a ghost for a mother. At 4 years old when Rebecca died, her memories were fragmentary. The smell of her mother's perfume, the sound of her laughter, the warmth of bedtime stories. As Natalie moved through childhood and adolescence, she carried the weight of being the girl whose mother was murdered. In high school, she wrote a poem titled "The Empty Chair" that won a regional poetry contest and appeared in the Harrisburg Patriot News. It began, "She sits at every dinner we eat alone. Her laugh echoes in rooms she'll never see. 20 years have passed, but I still check the door, hoping tonight is the night she comes home to me." The poem struck a nerve. It was shared across Pennsylvania, discussed in grief counseling groups, read at victim advocacy events. For a brief moment, Rebecca's case returned to public consciousness. But moments fade, and soon the attention disappeared again. Thomas never remarried. Friends and family gently suggested he should move on and find happiness again. But how could he? Rebecca's killer was still out there, somewhere, breathing the same Pennsylvania air, living a life while Rebecca lay in Hillside Cemetery. The injustice of it consumed him. He became an advocate for cold case investigations, attending Pennsylvania state legislature hearings, writing letters to the Attorney General's office, meeting with other families of unsolved murder victims. In Millbrook, the case became a defining moment in the town's history. Parents held their children closer. Women didn't walk alone at night. the Harvest Festival continued each October, but it lost its innocence. People looked at neighbors differently now, wondering who among them could commit such violence. Theories circulated through churches, diners, and hair salons. A drifter passing through town, a registered sex offender from another county, even whispers about Thomas himself, though anyone who truly knew him dismissed such suspicions immediately. Detective Marcus Donovan retired from the Pennsylvania State Police in 2007, but never forgot Rebecca Hartman. He kept a copy of her case file at home, reviewing it periodically, hoping some detail would suddenly make sense. Then in 2018, news broke that investigators had arrested the Golden State Killer using a revolutionary technique called investigative genetic genealogy. For the first time in years, Donovan, now 67 years old, felt a surge of hope. Could this technique finally identify Rebecca's killer? He reached out to the Pennsylvania State Police Cold Case Unit, urging them to consider Rebecca's case for this new technology. The response was polite but non-committal. Budget constraints, limited resources, dozens of cases ahead in line. But hope is a fragile thing when you're waiting for justice that may never come. Or so they thought. August 2022, Pennsylvania Attorney General Michelle Henry announced a major initiative that would change everything for families like the Hartmans. The Pennsylvania Cold Case Unit would partner with Parabon Nano Labs, a Virginia-based company specializing in investigative genetic genealogy, to review unsolved violent crimes from the 1980s and 1990s. Rebecca Hartman's case was selected as one of 50 priority cases for analysis. Detective Raymond Torres of the Pennsylvania State Police Cold Case Unit pulled Rebecca's case file from storage that September. At 34 years old, Torres hadn't even been born when Rebecca was murdered, but he approached the case with fresh determination. He reviewed Detective Donovan's thorough investigation, examined the preserved biological evidence, and contacted Parabon to begin the process. The DNA sample collected in 1993, carefully frozen and preserved for 29 years, was sent to Parabon's laboratory. This is where the science gets fascinating. Traditional DNA analysis, the kind used by law enforcement databases like CODIS, examines specific markers called short tandem repeats. It's perfect for matching a suspect's DNA directly to crime scene evidence, but it can't identify unknown suspects. Genetic genealogy works differently. Using advanced SNP analysis, single nucleotide polymorphism, scientists examined hundreds of thousands of genetic markers across the entire genome. This is the same technology used by consumer DNA testing companies like 23andMe and Ancestry.com. Think of it like Ancestry.com, but instead of finding your great-great-grandfather, you're hunting a killer. On October 3, 2022, Parabon uploaded the killer's genetic profile to GEDmatch, a public genealogy database containing DNA information from over 1.3 million people interested in tracing their ancestry. Within hours, the system identified several matches, distant cousins who shared segments of DNA with the unknown killer. The closest match was a third cousin, sharing a common ancestor born around 1850. Now came the real detective work. Parabon's expert genealogists began building family trees. Starting with each DNA match, they researched backward through census records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, death records, and newspaper archives to identify the most recent common ancestor shared with the killer. Then they worked forward, documenting every descendant of that common ancestor through 7 generations. The process took 3 weeks of painstaking work, Genealogists constructed massive family trees containing hundreds of potential individuals. Then they systematically narrowed the list using known information about the suspect. Male, likely between ages 20 and 45 in 1993, living in or near central Pennsylvania, with access to transportation and knowledge of Michaud State Forest's remote areas. By October 25, 2022, the list had shrunk to 4 viable candidates. Detective Torres reviewed each name carefully, researching backgrounds, checking 1993 addresses, verifying employment records. One name made his heart race: Richard Allen Coleman, age 58, currently residing in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania, just 15 miles from Millbrook. Torres pulled up Coleman's background. In 1993, Richard Coleman had been 29 years old, working as an assistant manager at the Millbrook hardware store on Main Street. He had lived in Millbrook his entire life, knew every back road and hiking trail in the county, and would have been at the Harvest Festival that night. The hardware store sponsored a booth selling tools and home repair supplies. But the revelation that sent a chill through Torres was this: Richard Coleman had known Rebecca Hartman. He served on the Millbrook Elementary School Parent-Teacher Advisory Board in 1992-1993. He attended school meetings, helped organize fundraisers, and knew all the teachers personally. Richard Coleman wasn't some stranger passing through town. He was the friendly face behind the hardware store counter, the man who helped elderly residents fix leaky faucets for free, the volunteer coach for Little League Baseball. Richard Coleman was beloved in Millbrook, which is exactly why no one had ever suspected him of murder. This is where everything changes. If this story is gripping you, drop a like and let us know. Have you heard of genetic genealogy solving cold cases before? Detective Torres dug deeper into Richard Coleman's background, and with each detail, the betrayal grew worse. In 1993, Coleman worked at Millbrook Hardware Store, a family-owned business on Main Street that had served the community for decades. As assistant manager, he was a fixture, greeting customers by name, recommending the right tool for every job, offering advice on home repairs. Ask anyone in Millbrook about the hardware store in the early 90s, and they'd remember Richard Coleman's friendly smile and willingness to help. But his community involvement went far beyond retail. Coleman volunteered with the Millbrook Little League, coaching youth baseball teams for 3 consecutive seasons. Parents trusted him with their children. He organized fundraising car washes, supervised practices, and drove kids to away games when parents couldn't make it. In 1992, Coleman was appointed to the Millbrook Elementary School Parent-Teacher Advisory Board, even though he didn't have children of his own. He attended monthly meetings, helped plan the annual Fall Festival fundraiser, and worked alongside teachers, including Rebecca Hartman, to improve school programs. He knew the layout of the school, he knew the teachers' schedules, he knew Rebecca. On the night of October 16, 1993, Millbrook Hardware sponsored a booth at the Harvest Festival selling hammers, screwdrivers, and home repair supplies at discounted prices. Richard Coleman would have been there, working the booth, surrounded by neighbors and friends. He would have seen Rebecca walking through the festival. He would have tracked her movements. He would have followed her to the parking lot. This wasn't some drifter passing through. This was the friendly face everyone trusted. Detective Torres reviewed the original 1993 investigation files, searching for Coleman's name. He expected to find him interviewed as a witness, maybe even questioned as a potential suspect, given his proximity to Rebecca. But Coleman's name appeared nowhere. Not in the witness interview logs, not in the suspect lists. Nowhere. Why? Because in small-town America in 1993, nobody suspected the nice man who helped fix your porch steps. Nobody suspected the volunteer coach who bought ice cream for the kids after games. Nobody suspected Richard Coleman of anything more serious than occasionally overcharging for paint supplies. For 29 years, Rebecca's killer walked Millbrook streets. He sold hammers and nails to the people searching for their teacher. He likely attended her funeral service at Millbrook Baptist Church. He watched Thomas Hartman crumble under grief. He saw 4-year-old Natalie grow up without her mother. He lived a normal life while the Hartman family lived in devastation. He smiled at the community memorial services held every October 16th. He nodded sympathetically when customers mentioned the tragedy. He expressed shock and sadness like everyone else. He was one of them, or so they believed. Detective Torres had a name. He had genetic genealogy pointing directly to Richard Coleman. But in Pennsylvania, that wasn't enough. Pennsylvania law requires confirmatory DNA evidence before making an arrest in genetic genealogy cases. The genealogy analysis establishes probable cause, but investigators need a direct DNA sample from the suspect to confirm the match using traditional forensic analysis. Torres couldn't simply knock on Coleman's door and demand a cheek swab. That would tip him off and potentially allow him to flee. He needed what's called abandoned DNA, genetic material voluntarily discarded in a public place where there's no expectation of privacy. On November 2, 2022, surveillance operations began. 2 undercover detectives monitored Coleman's residence in Mechanicsburg, documenting his daily routines. Coleman, now 58 years old, worked as a facilities manager for a commercial property management company. He lived alone in a modest ranch house on Birch Lane, drove a gray Ford F-150 pickup truck, and followed a predictable schedule. Every morning, Coleman left his house at 7:15 a.m. and stopped at the same Dunkin' Donuts on Route 11 before heading to work. He ordered the same thing every time: medium coffee, black, no sugar. November 8, 2022, at 7:23 a.m., Detective Torres and his partner followed Coleman to Dunkin' Donuts. Coleman pulled into the drive-through lane, placed his order through the speaker, paid at the window, and drove off with his coffee. Torres waited exactly 2 minutes, then approached the drive-through window himself. What Coleman didn't know was that Pennsylvania State Police had already coordinated with Dunkin' Donuts management. The moment Coleman pulled away, employees retrieved his discarded coffee cup from the trash receptacle behind the counter, carefully handling it by the edges to preserve any biological material on the rim. The cup was sealed in an evidence bag and transported directly to the Pennsylvania State Police laboratory. Forensic technicians swabbed the rim of the coffee cup where Coleman's lips had touched. DNA extraction followed, cells from saliva left behind during his morning coffee ritual. The extracted DNA was amplified using PCR technology and analyzed using STR profiling, the gold standard for forensic identification. November 15, 2022, at 2:47 p.m., the laboratory results arrived in Detective Torres's email inbox. He opened the attachment, his hand trembling slightly as he scrolled through the technical data. Match confirmed. 20 genetic markers analyzed. The DNA from the coffee cup matched the DNA from Rebecca Hartman's murder scene at every single locus. The statistical probability that this DNA belonged to anyone other than Richard Coleman? 1 in 47 billion. There are fewer than 8 billion people on Earth. Richard Coleman was Rebecca Hartman's killer. The science was irrefutable. Torres immediately contacted Cumberland County District Attorney Sean McCormick. Within 3 hours, prosecutors reviewed the entire case file, the 1993 investigation, the genetic genealogy results, the confirmatory DNA match, Coleman's connection to Rebecca and the Harvest Festival. Everything aligned perfectly. That same evening, Judge Patricia Lawson reviewed the arrest warrant application. She signed it at 6:32 p.m. Richard Coleman had no idea that his morning coffee was about to end 29 years of freedom. November 17th, 2022, 6:15 a.m. The sun hadn't yet risen over Mechanicsburg when Pennsylvania State Police vehicles surrounded Richard Coleman's ranch house on Birch Lane. Detective Torres led a tactical team of 8 officers. They couldn't risk Coleman fleeing or destroying evidence. At 6:17 a.m., officers knocked hard on the front door. "Pennsylvania State Police! Search warrant!" Neighbors emerged onto porches in bathrobes, coffee mugs in hand, watching the scene unfold. Within 90 seconds, the door opened. Richard Coleman stood there in pajama pants and a worn Penn State t-shirt, his graying hair disheveled, his face draining of color as he saw the officers. "Richard Allen Coleman, you're under arrest for the murder of Rebecca Hartman." Detective Torres's voice was calm but firm. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back." Coleman said nothing. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Officers turned him around and secured handcuffs around his wrists. His wife, who he'd married in 2001, 8 years after Rebecca's murder, stood in the hallway behind him, her hand over her mouth, eyes wide with shock. As officers led Coleman to the patrol vehicle, she collapsed against the doorframe, sobbing. By 7 a.m., news vans had descended on Birch Lane. By 8 a.m., the story exploded across Pennsylvania. Beloved businessman arrested for 1993. Teacher murder. DNA evidence cracks 29-year-old cold case. Social media erupted. The Millbrook Community Facebook group, normally filled with posts about lost pets and yard sale announcements, became a battleground of disbelief and anger. "This can't be real. Rick Coleman helped me fix my roof when I couldn't afford a contractor. He spent an entire Saturday doing it for free. He coached my son's baseball team in 2010. He was patient, kind, and the kids loved him. This is impossible. I've known Rick for 40 years. He wouldn't hurt anyone. This has to be a mistake." But other voices emerged, quieter and more disturbing. Looking back, he was always too friendly, standing too close to women, touching shoulders when he talked. "My daughter said he made her uncomfortable at a Little League game once. She was 14. I dismissed it at the time. He never married until his late 30s, always lived alone. Now it makes sense." At Millbrook Elementary, now a renovated building with a new generation of students, Principal Dorothy Martinez sat in her office, stunned. She'd been a young teacher in 1993, fresh out of college, working alongside Rebecca. She remembered Richard Coleman at PTA meetings, always volunteering for committees, always offering to help. "He sat in the same row as Rebecca at those meetings," Martinez told reporters that afternoon, her voice shaking. "He looked us all in the eye after she died and said how terrible it was, how Millbrook would never be the same. He attended her memorial service, and he was the one who killed her." The betrayal cut deeper than the crime itself. At his home in Carlisle, Thomas had moved away from Millbrook in 2003, unable to bear the memories. Detective Torres made the phone call he'd been waiting 29 years to make. "Mr. Hartman, this is Detective Torres with Pennsylvania State Police. I have news about your wife's case." Stunned silence. Then Thomas's voice, barely a whisper. "You found him?" We arrested him this morning. DNA match. It's definitive. Natalie, now 33 years old and living in Philadelphia, received a call from her father minutes later. She sat down on her apartment floor, phone pressed to her ear, tears streaming down her face. "Mom died at the hands of someone we trusted," she would later tell reporters. "Someone who smiled at us. Someone who pretended to care. That's what hurts the most." Richard Coleman's arraignment took place on November 21st, 2022, at Cumberland County Courthouse. Standing before Judge Harold Morrison, dressed in an orange jumpsuit, Coleman entered his plea. Not guilty. His defense attorney, Michael Brennan, immediately filed motions challenging the admissibility of genetic genealogy evidence, arguing it violated privacy rights and hadn't been adequately tested in Pennsylvania courts. On February 14, 2023, Judge Morrison denied the motion. Pennsylvania appellate courts had already upheld genetic genealogy in previous cases. The evidence would stand. The trial began on June 5, 2023. The courtroom in Carlisle was packed. Thomas and Natalie Hartman sat in the front row, surrounded by Rebecca's siblings and friends who had waited nearly 3 decades for this moment. News crews lined the hallway outside, cameras ready to capture every development. District Attorney Sean McCormick presented the Commonwealth's case methodically. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the forensic DNA analyst from the Pennsylvania State Police Laboratory, took the stand on day 3. For 90 minutes, she walked the jury through the science. She explained how DNA collected in 1993 had been preserved perfectly, how genetic genealogy had identified Coleman through distant relatives, and how the confirmatory DNA from the coffee cup matched the crime scene evidence at 20 separate genetic markers. What is the statistical probability that this DNA belongs to someone other than Richard Coleman? McCormick asked. Dr. Warren looked directly at the jury. 1 in 47 billion. There aren't that many humans on Earth. Prosecutors established Coleman's connection to Rebecca. He served on the parent-teacher advisory board. He knew her schedule, her routines, where she parked. His hardware store booth was at the Harvest Festival that night. Witnesses placed him there until at least 9:30 p.m., less than 20 minutes before Rebecca was last seen alive. Coleman owned a pickup truck in 1993, capable of transporting a body to Michaud State Forest. He knew the area intimately, having hiked and camped there since childhood. Most damning, Coleman had no alibi. His girlfriend at the time had been visiting family in Ohio that weekend. Coleman lived alone. Nobody could account for his whereabouts between 9:30 p.m. on October 16th and the morning of October 17th. 3 women testified about Coleman's behavior during the early 1990s. One described him standing uncomfortably close while helping her select paint colors, his hand lingering on her lower back. Another recalled Coleman offering to help install a ceiling fan in her bedroom, then making inappropriate comments about her appearance. A third woman, a teacher at Millbrook Elementary, remembered Coleman frequently finding excuses to visit the school, always seeking out female teachers to talk to. The defense presented character witnesses, neighbors, former co-workers, Little League parents, who described Coleman as helpful, generous, and kind. But they couldn't overcome DNA evidence with probability statistics measured in billions. Then came the family testimony. Thomas Hartman took the stand on June 26th, his voice breaking as he described 29 years of raising Natalie alone, of sleeping in an empty bed, of attending father-daughter dances without a partner to share those moments. Natalie testified the following day. Now 33 years old, a social worker in Philadelphia, she spoke about the empty chair at her wedding reception in 2019, the seat reserved for her mother, who should have been there to see her daughter in her wedding dress, to dance with her, to cry tears of joy. "He took everything from us," Natalie said, looking directly at Coleman. "Not just my mother's life, my entire childhood, every milestone she should have witnessed." Coleman stared at the table, expressionless. June 29th, 2023. After 7 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. Guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault. Judge Morrison scheduled sentencing for August 15th, 2023. August 15th, 2023. The same courtroom in Carlisle that had witnessed the trial now filled with people who had waited nearly 3 decades for this moment. Thomas Hartman, now 60 years old, sat in the front row beside Natalie. Detective Marcus Donovan, the original investigator who'd retired 16 years earlier, sat 3 rows back. He'd driven from his home in Lancaster to witness the conclusion of the case that had haunted him. Judge Morrison called the courtroom to order. "We're here for sentencing in Commonwealth versus Richard Allen Coleman. Before I impose sentence, the victims' families have the right to address the court." Thomas stood slowly, his hands gripping a folded piece of paper. He'd written and rewritten his statement a dozen times over the past 6 weeks. When he spoke, his voice was steady but heavy with emotion. "Your Honor, on October 16th, 1993, Richard Coleman didn't just murder my wife, he murdered our future together. He stole the mother from my 4-year-old daughter, who had to grow up asking questions I couldn't answer. Why did Mommy leave? Where did she go? When is she coming home?" Thomas's voice cracked. "I've spent 29 years sleeping in an empty bed, 29 years attending school plays alone, celebrating birthdays with a chair nobody sits in, putting flowers on a grave that shouldn't exist yet. Every morning I wake up, and for just a moment, I forget she's gone. Then reality hits all over again." He looked directly at Coleman, who sat motionless at the defense table. "You walked past me at the grocery store. You probably sold me supplies to fix things around my house. You smiled and acted like you cared while carrying the secret of what you did to Rebecca. That betrayal is almost worse than the murder itself." Thomas's statement lasted 30 minutes. When he finished, Natalie stood. "I don't remember my mother's voice anymore," she began quietly. "I was 4 when he took her from me. I know her through photographs, through stories other people tell me, through the video of my 3rd birthday party that I've watched 1,000 times. But I don't remember what her hugs felt like. I don't remember her bedtime stories. I don't remember her." Natalie paused, wiping tears from her cheeks. "People ask if I can forgive him. I've learned that forgiveness isn't for him, it's for me, so I can move forward without carrying his poison in my heart. But forgiveness doesn't mean there shouldn't be consequences. Justice may take decades, but it can still come." When the family statements concluded, Judge Morrison asked Coleman if he wished to address the court. His attorney leaned over, whispering in his ear. Coleman shook his head. He remained silent, his face blank, showing no remorse. Judge Morrison spoke clearly and firmly. "Mr. Coleman, a jury of your peers found you guilty of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault. The DNA evidence proves your guilt beyond any shadow of doubt. You betrayed your community's trust in the worst way imaginable. You lived freely for 29 years while an innocent family suffered." He paused. I hereby sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole." The gavel struck. Justice was served, 29 years late, but served nonetheless. Justice was served, but at what cost? Share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think genetic genealogy should be used more widely to solve cold cases? The conviction of Richard Coleman created shockwaves far beyond one Pennsylvania courtroom. In September 2023, Pennsylvania Attorney General Michelle Henry announced a major expansion of the state's cold case initiative. $5.4 million in funding, allocated to review over 200 unsolved violent crimes from the 1980s and 1990s using genetic genealogy. As of early 2024, 17 additional cases from that era are now under active investigation, using the same techniques that identified Coleman. Families who'd spent decades without answers suddenly have hope again. The case taught law enforcement a critical lesson about evidence preservation. In 1993, the DNA technology needed to identify an unknown killer simply didn't exist. The genetic profile sat frozen in a laboratory, scientifically useless for 29 years. But investigators had the foresight to preserve it properly, maintaining the chain of custody and ensuring the biological samples remained viable. Today's untestable evidence is tomorrow's conviction. Evidence that seems useless now might become the breakthrough in a decade or 2 decades. That lesson has transformed how crime labs handle and store biological evidence. In Millbrook, the community engaged in painful but necessary conversations. How had Coleman hidden in plain sight for so long? What warning signs had been missed? Parents, teachers, and community leaders began discussing predatory behavior more openly, recognizing that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like the friendly hardware store manager who helps fix your leaky faucet. The Millbrook Elementary School Parent-Teacher Association established the Rebecca Hartman Memorial Scholarship in 2024, awarding $5,000 annually to education majors at nearby Shippensburg University. Rebecca's legacy now lives on through future teachers she'll never meet. For the Hartman family, Coleman's sentencing allowed something they'd been unable to do for 29 years: truly say goodbye. In September 2023, Thomas and Natalie organized a celebration of life ceremony at Millbrook Baptist Church, the same church where Rebecca's funeral had been held in 1993. But this time, the tone was different. They celebrated Rebecca's warmth, her dedication to teaching, her love for her family. They shared joyful memories instead of drowning in unanswered questions. "We can start living again instead of just surviving," Thomas said afterward. "For 29 years, we've been frozen in 1993, trapped in that parking lot with her. Now we can move forward." Detective Marcus Donovan, now 82 years old and using a cane, attended Coleman's sentencing with tears streaming down his face. "I promised Thomas in 1993 that we'd find who did this," he said. "Science caught up to this case. It took longer than I hoped, but justice came." His words carry hope for thousands of families still waiting. Approximately 250,000 unsolved murders remain open in the United States. DNA, technology that didn't exist in 1993, solved Rebecca's case in 2022. What technology will exist in 2030 or 2040 that will solve cases we consider hopeless today? The answer: we don't know yet, but Rebecca Hartman's case proves we should never stop trying. Richard Coleman, now 59 years old, sits in SCI Phoenix, a maximum security prison in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania. He'll spend the rest of his life there. No parole, no second chances, no freedom. For 29 years, he lived freely while the Hartman family endured unimaginable pain. He walked streets, enjoyed sunsets, celebrated holidays, lived a life he had no right to live. But the DNA he left behind in 1993 waited patiently, frozen in a laboratory, silent but damning. When science finally advanced enough to speak its truth, it spoke louder than any witness ever could. Rebecca Hartman's case carries a powerful message for other families waiting for answers. Hope exists. Science keeps advancing. Technologies that seem like science fiction today will be standard practice tomorrow. Justice sometimes takes decades, but that doesn't mean it won't come. Thomas Hartman spoke at a Pennsylvania cold case advocacy event in November 2023, addressing other families trapped in the same nightmare he'd lived through. Keep calling police departments, stay connected with victim advocacy groups, keep your loved one's name alive. Your moment might come too. October 2023. Exactly 30 years after Rebecca walked into darkness and never returned. Thomas and Natalie stand at her grave in Hillside Cemetery. The headstone, recently updated, now reads, Rebecca Ann Hartman, beloved wife, mother, teacher, 1965-1993, justice served 2023. Natalie places a bouquet of autumn flowers against the stone, the same flowers that bloomed the night her mother disappeared. She kneels, touching the engraved letters with her fingertips. It's finally over, Mom, she whispers. We can rest now. You can rest now. Wind rustles through the maple trees overhead. In the distance, children's laughter echoes from Millbrook Elementary's playground, where a new generation learns and grows, students who will never know Rebecca Hartman, but benefit from the scholarship bearing her name. Cold cases are never truly cold. They're waiting. If this story moved you, if you believe no victim should be forgotten, hit that subscribe button. Comment below with your thoughts on this case. How does genetic genealogy change the landscape of justice? And remember, justice may be delayed, but it's never denied. See you in the next video, where we uncover more truths that refuse to stay buried.